Hi everyone. It's great to see so many people here tonight, and I love the banner that was up there about legacy and leadership, because I'm sure the years I spent at John Curtin Senior High School, I learnt those skills very well, and so much so that it took me through my career as a teacher to a job as a principal, and there's very few of us Noongar principals around. Loved it. And I'm Fremantle, purple and passionate, Kim. Grew up in White Gum Valley and then on to John Curtin Senior High School. Fremantle's always been my home. Although, mind you, I've spent probably about 35 years off country when I was teaching, here, there and everywhere, from Cable Beach to Albany to Yolngu to Derby and most places in between, but loved it. And I'd go back tomorrow if I was younger. I haven't got the patience today. My great-grandchildren are about as much as I would like to do with children closely. And I've got 20 of them. 20 grandchildren, 20 great-grandchildren. So, and they're not all ovals either. That's the difficult part. They're not even collards. So there's anything and everything in between. But anyway, I want to say kaya, kunami. Hello, hello and welcome. Ṉäku Dhäruk. After the defeat of the referendum, I thought, what am I going to do? Do I just sit in the corner and cry, poor fella me? No, not Frida. She got up and she thought, oh no, I really enjoyed Eleanor Roosevelt and all her quotes and things. And I thought, no, I'm going to do that. So I found one that I liked. With the new day comes new strength and new thoughts. And I thought, that's my platform. And that's why I need to go out and speak to the community. Speak to schools still. I tell people I'm retired, but I'm not. So I decided to translate Ṉäku Dhäruk. Angan kura. I pay my respects to my past, present and future leaders, Buddhias and strangers on Whadjuk land. Our cardigan, or knowledge and understanding of Noongar Budja, Budja is country, reflects our deep spiritual and physical connection to the country, to places of significance. For each Noongar group, there is a place of significance where we go to celebrate or pay tribute to those who have passed on. And my place is Fremantle. And I'm going over to Wodgem in another week's time to celebrate. And I said, no, I need to go over there because I think there are a lot of untruths and certainly a lot of bad vibes and bad wirran that's over there, the bad spirits. So I said, I'm going over there to do my business and to be that mediator between that part and this part, because it was always, oh, they're over there. Out of sight, out of mind. So true. So our cardigan, or knowledge and understanding of Noongar Budja country, reflects our deep spiritual and physical connection to country and to places of significance. For each Noongar group, there is a place of significance where we go to celebrate and pay tribute to those who have passed on. Yirrkala Bark. As a Whadjuk Balladong custodian and traditional owner and a matriarch, I welcome you to the Great Sea and the great rivers, the Yirrkala and the Yolngu, or the Canning River, which means abundance, where my family and ancestors left their footprints while gathering their food and constructing their maya for over 60,000 years. I grew up in a camp. I learned to read by that fire tin. I learned to read by the candle and by the lights with the wick. And I thought, oh, how did I get on? I don't know, but I was a reader. And my mother used to always say, if you don't put that book away, I'm going to get a stick, I'm going to lay it across your backside, Frida. Yes, Mum, I'll be there in a minute. That minute sometime lasted an hour. So everything in our vast landscape has meaning and purpose. We speak our own language and have our own law and customs. The law is characterised by a strong spiritual connection to country. This means caring for the natural environment and for places of significance. Our law is practiced from a cultural governance system following an unspoken yet understood law. I know. Sometimes I don't know, and I have to go and ask my big brother. He sometimes tells me the truth, but sometimes he takes me on a wild ride. Like the time he said to me, "Freda, can you fish?" "Yeah, of course I can fish." "Why?" I said. "Because," he said, "when you die, your spirit goes up the canyon, which is on the south side of Wajima." I said, "All right." "Well, I'm still here scratching my head. How does your spirit eat?" "I don't know. But I'm going to come back one day and I'm going to poke him and tell him if it's truth or not. But it should be fun." So the law is practiced from a cultural governance system following an unspoken yet understood law. I know. Noongar elders maintain cultural governance and have the responsibility and obligation to share and pass on. Kārijin, Wara Buja, Wira Nijamurich. Our knowledge and understanding reflects deep spiritual and physical connection to the land and places of significance. We stand on Burlu, a significant site during massacres, celebrations, and a place to communicate for the community. Connection to Buja is passed on through our stories, art, and our ceremonial dances. For Noongar people, the southwest of Western Australia is Ngala Buja, our country. Noongar people have a cultural responsibility with the Buja by respecting the land, caring for it, and protecting it through traditional sustainable practices. We continue to demonstrate our strong connection to the country. So as we stand here today to look up and down the land to where the river meanders and meets the horizon and the sky, look at the sun which warms the land and the waves and the rain to nourish and encourage growth. As Noongar people, we come to know our connection to country through our murut or our family. This means we can identify our country, the place where we feel at home, where we can move about freely, without having to obtain anyone's permission. Noongar law and custom guides the way in which we define our country and our rights to it. Law influences how we have a duty to speak for our country. So I invite you to walk beside me and share the history, language and culture of the Noongar people. This contribution makes a rich tapestry to move forward in reconciliation and truth. And Yanka, thank you. And Budawan, because we don't say goodbye, I'll see you later. So thank you. Enjoy your evening.
Thank you, Auntie Freda, for that wonderful welcome. I would like to acknowledge the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation as the traditional custodians of the land on which we're meeting today, and pay my respects to the elders past and present. In designing this refurbished library that we're enjoying today, the university has sought very much to pay homage to Indigenous cultures that were here long before us. And part of that, we've had some bilingual signage in the building. There's also a dedicated space for Indigenous students. And we also have a fabulous artwork in the atrium. And if you haven't seen that, it's a great interaction between that Western scientific, the sort of glass vials that are suspended over the atrium, and the Noongar message sticks and Indigenous flora that's represented in the porcelain inside those vials are really beautiful to see. So if you haven't got to see those, I would encourage you to have a look on your way out. Anyway, good evening everybody, and Kaya. Welcome to the 2024 John Curtin Prime Ministerial Anniversary Lecture. My name's Kylie Percival, I'm the University Librarian, and I'll be your MC tonight. Now, I have to confess, this is my first John Curtin Prime Ministerial Lecture. I've been here for 2 years, but last year I had COVID, so that sort of put me out of action. And I'm pleased to be with you tonight and looking forward to this evening. Now, I have a couple of housekeeping matters. In the extremely unlikely event of emergency, we'll have to evacuate, follow the directions of libraries and events staff. There are, and please only use the stairwells. There are 5 stairwells, so there's plenty of stairwell opportunities. The closest one is immediately to the left as you came in the door. Far more likely to happen is that you've brought a phone with you tonight, and so my other thing is to remind you to switch that to silent. That would be great. Bathrooms also The door that you came in, to the left of that, if you're going out the other way, you'll find those. And I think that's my housekeeping duties complete. So I'm really looking forward to this, to tonight, because I think it's a chance for us to reflect on John Curtin's legacy, as well as think about what it means to be an Australian now in 2025 or 2024, I'm getting ahead of myself, and what are some of our contemporary issues that we might want to explore in conversation with one another. So it is now my pleasure to hand over to someone who's much more experienced in John Curtin Prime Ministerial Anniversary Lectures, and I'll ask you to join me welcoming our Vice-Chancellor, Professor Harlene Hayne.
Thank you very much, Kylie, and thank you, Auntie Frida, for yet another beautifully warm welcome to this puja. It's always lovely to have you here. And I know that your history is as a teacher, but tonight you get to be a student as well. And I'm sure that you will enjoy that. Kaya, everyone, it is with deep respect that I also acknowledge that we are meeting on the traditional lands of the Whadjuk people, and I pay my respects to elders past and present. When I stand in this beautiful lantern room, I can't help but express my gratitude for sharing this land with the oldest continuing culture in the world. People have lived and loved and learned and laughed on this puja for tens of thousands of years, and I know that we have much to learn from them. For those of you who don't know me very well, I think you can probably tell from my accent that I am not originally from Australia. I was born in the United States, and I grew up in the state of Colorado. And even though I'm currently standing about 16,000 kilometers away from my home, the blue sky and the red dirt of Western Australia feels remarkably familiar to me, and I'm incredibly grateful to the generations of people who have looked after this land for such a long time. I'd really like to acknowledge the amazing distinguished guests that we have with us this evening, not the least of which is our wonderful Honourable Kim Beazley, AC, former Labour leader and joint patron of the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library. He joins the Honourable Julia Gillard in that shared patronage. When I first arrived in Australia, we were locked in Western Australia, and as an American, I felt so incredibly grateful to make Kim's acquaintance, because one of the things that he has obviously done in his very distinguished career is to be the Australian ambassador to the United States. And I feel quite humbled by the fact that this man knows more about American history than anyone I have ever met in my life. And because he was trapped in Western Australia, we had multiple opportunities to discuss that. So Kim, it's always lovely to have you here. And thank you so much for your friendship. I'd also like to welcome the Honourable John Codwell, and most importantly, many, many members of the John Curtin family who have joined us here this evening. So for many of us who are here, this is a professional experience, but I really recognize the fact that this is a very personal journey for all of you, and I know that you have many important ways to spend your time, so we're incredibly grateful that you always come and support this lecture. So welcome, and we look forward to your reactions to the lecture, and certainly we will continue to invite you back year on year. So I'd like to welcome all of you. It's a very full house that we have this evening for the 2024 John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture. Since 1988, the JCPML Anniversary Lecture has been held to commemorate the enormous contributions of Prime Minister John Curtin, after whom this university is so proudly named. Each year, the anniversary lecture provides an opportunity not only to reflect on the enduring legacy of John Curtin, but also to engage with the views of thought leaders here and now. Now, widely regarded by me, and now completely verified, John Curtin was Australia's greatest Prime Minister. He led this nation through the perils of World War II, and he served this nation as its Prime Minister from October 1941 to July 1945. He also, in addition to his incredible leadership during that very tumultuous period, he also laid the policy foundations for the nation's post-war prosperity. Now, John Curtin's inspirational leadership and personal character provide many lessons on the importance of social justice, basic fairness, and the equality of all people, and that legacy continues to inspire the spirit of our university. Now, this evening, I am incredibly proud to announce that Curtin University will soon launch a new micro-credential that will share this spirit even further. And that credential is entitled John Curtin's Vision, Legacy, and Leadership. It will explore the legacy of John Curtin through the lens of contemporary challenges and opportunities. It will examine John Curtin's approach to nation building and achieving change through effective leadership, and how history, philosophy, and the values that Curtin offers, that he offered to a new approach to many contemporaneous issues. The micro-credential is informed by the fields of history, sociology, politics, and international relations, and the course provides real-world applications of the lessons gained from specific case studies to build institutional, national, and global diplomacy and leadership. It is our hope that through this credential, students, staff, and the wider community can learn from John Curtin's leadership, and current and future leaders can continue to be inspired by his legacy. Now, it is my pleasure, if the technology cooperates with us, to share with you a preview of this micro-credential, John Curtin's Vision, Legacy, and Leadership. So, Athena?
Since Federation in 1901, Australia has had 31 Prime Ministers. There is one individual who consistently stands at the head of the pack. The 14th Prime Minister of Australia, this man, John Curtin. This credential is a chance to learn about one of Western Australia's great heroes and most influential people, and how he achieved this influence. As Prime Minister from 1941 to 1945, he led Australia through the existential crisis of World War II.
You're going to come away with an understanding of this man whose name you see everywhere, John Curtin. Who was he? What drove him? What experiences through his life built him into the great wartime leader? Another thing that you're going to come away from this course with is an ability to handle primary sources, to understand how history is made, what history is made up of, and how to do some of the analysis.
John Curtin is important for his resilient leadership. He faced many crises and setbacks, both on a national and a personal scale, and understanding him gives us insights into how to overcome these challenges.
John Curtin was someone who managed to work with people of all different types of perspective, from all different backgrounds, and he did that while maintaining really high ideals and having a very radical view of what direction the world should be taken.
The influence of him and his government is embedded in our society, often in ways we are not conscious of, things that we take for granted. From the personal to the collective, Curtin's legacy is significant today.
So we are incredibly grateful to have this micro-credential, and wait for further attractions. We will be launching this on quite a large scale, and people will have the opportunity to find out how they can take part in following the entire credential. All right, so turning to tonight's event. It's absolutely my pleasure that we have finally been able to secure Professor Clare Wright OAM as our John Curtin anniversary lecture speaker. Clare is a professor of history and a professor of public engagement at La Trobe University, and she is also an award-winning historian. She's an author and a broadcaster who has worked in politics, academia, and the media. She is the author of several books, including her Democracy trilogy, The Forgotten Rebels of Yirrkala, about the women of the Yirrkala Stockade, You Daughters of Freedom, about the leadership of Australian women in the local and global suffrage movement, and the recently released Ṉäku Dhäruk, The Bark Petitions, the story of the presentation of the Yirrkala Bark Petitions to the Federal Parliament in 1973, And Kim Beazley brought his dog-eared copy of the book, which he has already consumed, and I'm sure will share some of his insights in his thanks to Clare later this evening. Clare also created and co-wrote the 4-part documentary series, The War That Changed Us, part of the ABC's centenary of the World War I programming, and it won the ATOM Award for Best Documentary. Clare is also the writer and host of the ABC Radio National History Series and podcast, Shooting the Past, and she co-hosts the podcast Archive Fever. And last but certainly not least, she is also the chair of the Council of the National Museum of Australia. In 2020, Clare was awarded a Medal of the Order of Australia in the Australia Day Honours for her services to literature and to historical research. So please join me in welcoming Professor Clare Wright OAM to present the 2024 John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library Anniversary Lecture titled Ṉäku Dhäruk, the Bark Petitions, the Western Australian Connection. Budawan.
Thank you so much, everyone. I'm just making sure I've got my special clicker. Is my special clicker here?
Oh, yep.
That's mine?
That's right.
Thank you very much. All right. Well, kaya, it's a new word that I've learnt tonight. Would also say bookmark. Namadi bookmark. Nara napaki yaku Clare. Ga nara Yolngu yaku goimalulu. What I said there is, hello everybody. My name is Clare in English, and my Yolngu name is goimalulu, which means special tree. I'd like to begin by thanking Frida for that very special welcome. I really appreciate it. And I'd also like to acknowledge that we are meeting here this evening on the beautiful lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people, and pay my respects to all elders past and present for giving us the gift of allowing us to walk on their country, reside beside their waters, and shelter under their skies. I recognise that these lands were stolen and sovereignty was never ceded. This always was, and it always will be Aboriginal land. We should all be so grateful for the privilege. Thanks also to Vice-Chancellor Professor Harlene Hayne for your kind invitation to speak tonight. And I am very glad that I've managed to get here. There were quite a lot of COVID lockdowns, and you were locked in and we were locked out, and then a big book to write. So it's an honour to be here tonight, particularly in this anniversary year. I've been given 30 minutes to speak. This is the size of my latest book. It's the size of all my books. Me speaking, saying anything cogent in 30 minutes is about as likely as the sun setting in the east. But let's give this a crack, okay? I know Athena's going to be holding me to account over there. So, hang on. So yeah, I've entitled this talk tonight, Joining the Dots, Ṉäku Dhäruk, the Yirrkala Bark Petitions, which were presented in 1963, and the Western Australian Connection. I'll start by telling you something you do know. John Curtin was Australia's 14th Prime Minister. He's been curiously connected to many aspects of my work as an historian over the last 30 years. He was born in Creswick, Victoria in 1885. Creswick is less than 20 kilometres from Ballarat, where the Yirrkala Stockade occurred 31 years before Curtin's birth. The Yirrkala Stockade was the subject of the first book in my Democracy trilogy. Now, after Curtin's father, who's known to be a somewhat violent and syphilitic man, was discharged from the police force, he moved his young family to Melbourne, leasing a pub in Little Lonsdale Street. It was to be the first of many pubs the Curtin family lived in and worked in, as their household head failed at successive hotel ventures. Pubs, and particularly the history of female publicans, was the first of my books. It was my topic of my PhD, Beyond the Ladies' Lounge. It was first published in 2003 and has never been out of print. Most of the women I interviewed for that project told me that women make better publicans than men because they don't drink the proceeds of the business. It's something the colonial authorities of the new penal colony already knew to be true, allowing women to hold liquor licences as early as the 1790s. During World War I, Curtin was a rabid anti-conscriptionist, briefly imprisoned for his principled actions against the state. He refused a medical exam. Now, so too was fellow anti-Labor Party anti-conscriptionist Vida Goldstein, who spoke to crowds of over 100,000 people about her anti-military, anti-imperialist politics at Yarra Bank on a Sunday. Our black sheep, Adela Pankhurst, sent by her mother Emmeline to be shepherded by Vida, was also jailed at this time for her anti-war activism. That's Vida Goldstein and one of the peace rallies that she spoke to. Curtin stood unsuccessfully for the seat of Balaclava, as a Labor candidate in the 1914 federal election. Vida Goldstein stood unsuccessfully as well as an independent candidate in the seat of Kooyong. Unlike Curtin, she refused to compromise her antipathy towards party politics. I've written extensively, there's Adela Pankhurst being arrested in Melbourne in 1916. I've written extensively about Vida Goldstein in the second instalment of my democracy trilogy, You Daughters of Freedom, which tells the story behind the women's suffrage banner that hangs in Parliament House today, and in two ABC television documentaries, Utopia Girls. It's a bit hard to see in this light, but that's the woman who was cast in the role. And also The War That Changed Us. And in this scene in that documentary, Vida Goldstein is singing at one of the anti-conscription rallies, I didn't raise my son to be a soldier. Again, it's a little hard to see, but here's another banner from one of those conscription rallies. And you can see something about history. Sometimes the values that we would like our heroes to live up to don't necessarily adhere with contemporary standards. Interestingly, this was one of Curtin's publications. You can see his name on the bottom. Slides out of order. You Daughters of Freedom, and that suffrage banner hanging in Parliament House today. Now, bizarrely, Curtin shadows my personal as well as my professional life. As a young man, and despite a wonky eye, he was a gun sportsman. He played for Brunswick Football Club, while his nephew Claude played up the road for Fitzroy. Both of my sons and my daughter, because the times they ever changed, also played for Fitzroy. One still does. That's my Noah. That's me with my mum in the outer at the grandstand at the Brunswick Street Oval. Inner city Melbourne, like it was Curtin's for a while, is my stopping grounds. But as you in the room no doubt well know, Curtin, now married to Elsie, moved to Perth in 1917 to take up the editorship of the Australian Worker newspaper. As well as being a staunch defender of labour rights, the workers' solidarity of the goldfields in his DNA, he was also an advocate of the rights of women and children. He was more of his time than ahead of it in the pre-World War I era, a story of Australia's global prominence. It was the first federal jurisdiction in the world to give women full political equality with men, that's the right to vote and to stand for Parliament, as well as national forgetfulness. In Australian mythology, the birth of the nation was forged not at Federation, with its global gold standard in democracy, but at Gallipoli, where too many young men lost their lives. I'll return to the idea of Australia's national amnesia later. Indeed, Curtin was many things to many people, but is probably best known and most widely recognised for being Australia's wartime Prime Minister. Indeed, Wikipedia, suppository of all great historical knowledge, declares that Curtin was not only best known, but also most notable for leading the country through the majority of World War II. Curtin's Prime Ministership, lasting as it did from 1941 until 1945, neatly aligns with a paradigm-shifting era. His untimely death in office means there is no after-story. War was both Curtin's making and his swan song. Tonight, however, I don't want to talk about the fall of Singapore, or the Kokoda Track, or the bombing of Pearl Harbor, or Churchill or Roosevelt, or any of the other strategic or personality touchstones of World War II. Talk of war is almost always about the contest over territory, the forging of alliances and enmities over disputed dominions. Talk of war almost always leads us to matters of foreign policy and international relations. But I want to take you to a conflict, a territorial contest over land and sovereignty that happened in another place, at another time, a place much closer to home and a time closer to us now. Most Australians, hearing the phrase the Peninsula Campaign, would think of the distant shores of Gallipoli, where in 1915 the Anzacs fought against a foreign enemy, ostensibly in the cause of our freedom. World history buffs might know of the conflict on the Iberian Peninsula, in which Spain, Portugal and Great Britain were allied against French invasion and occupation during the Napoleonic Wars. In American history, talk of the Peninsula Campaign, Kim will know this obviously, evokes one of the Civil War's pivotal moments, the 1862 march by Union forces up the Virginia Peninsula towards the Confederate capital, Richmond. But a century after Robert E. Lee destroyed the Northern Army on the banks of the Potomac, another battle was waged much closer to the place Australians still call home, indeed at home, a battle which at the time was also referred to as the Peninsula Campaign. This contest for territorial control occurred on the Gove Peninsula, at the northeast tip of Arnhem Land in the Northern Territory. It concerned access to land that contained some of the richest bauxite reserves in the world and was played out over more than a decade from the early 1960s. The Minister for Territories in the Menzies government, Paul Hasluck, commanded the forces of commercial expansion and in international development at the top end. The Yolngu people of the Yirrkala region were the defenders of the land that had been legally reserved for them in 1931, and which they claimed ownership to in perpetuity based on their time-honoured political and legal systems. The Yolngu found collaborators among local missionaries and southern civil rights activists and politicians. The critical year in this conflict was 1963, when, in a strategic move of breathtaking originality, Yolngu elders delivered a formal entente to Canberra, paper and ink petitions pasted onto bark panels cut from the trees of their ancestral lands and painted in traditional designs and motifs. That's petitions in, I'm going to say, rabbity as a quotation marks, and I hope I get an opportunity to tell you why I'm doing that. Now, depending on your perspective, the creation of the mining town of Nhulunbuy, built in 1972, was either the spoils of victory or the price of defeat in Australia's homegrown Peninsula Campaign. Now, these metaphors I'm evoking here are drawn from the military, not the mining vernacular, for a reason. I've deployed them here to highlight how much of our national historical consciousness is built around war stories. We understand the language of conflict in binary adversarial terms, enemy and ally, victor and vanquished. But in reality, the story of how resource extraction led to a four-cornered contest between the federal government, the miners, the missionaries and the Yolngu over the right to define and control the tiny tip of northeast Arnhem Land is more complex and much more compelling than the winners and losers paradigm suggests. It's a big story. It's no spoiler alert to tell you who came out on top. Simply punch Nhulunbuy into the satellite view of Google Maps and look at the great red gashes on an otherwise dense green landmass, enfolded in the vertiginously blue waters of the Arafura Sea and Melville Bay. 60 years ago, there was nothing but green there. and the topographical rupture is only part of the picture. No map can lay out the sociological fissures. I took these photos when I was returning from Yirrkala about a month ago after I had the national launch of this book in Yirrkala. It was launched by 6 Yolngu elders. But a material record of events does exist that will take us deep into the heart of political darkness of 1963. So it's 2020, and it is a relic of this campaign that I stand before in the Members' Gallery of Parliament House in Canberra. The Yirrkala Bark Petitions, as they've come to know and have been come to know in Australia's civil and land rights history. And I'm looking at the ochre cross-hatching, the seemingly unsophisticated but unmistakable depiction of land and sea creatures, the foreign language. The petition is written in English and Yolngu mata. The parliamentary procedural stamps and the museum labels. And I'm standing and I'm looking and I'm feeling distinctly uneasy. Now, it's not like I haven't been here before. I regularly visit this Members' Gallery with its portrait parade of former Prime Ministers. John Curtin is there. He's not right next to the petitions. Directly across from these petitions is Tony Abbott and the Queen, which might be somebody's idea of a joke. But I was researching the women's suffrage banner, one of the jewels in the crown of Parliament House Historical Memorials collection. And the bark petitions are housed in a dark, squat wooden display cabinet within spitting distance of the banner. This little shelter that it's in, apparently Parliament House guides call the shed. So in that book, Your Daughters of Freedom, I gestured briefly at these petitions. In that book I called them small but precious items, part traditional Indigenous artwork, part Westminster-style petition, the first documents bridging Commonwealth law as it then stood and the Indigenous laws of the land. Then I saw ethnographic art overlaid with the desiderata of protest, a colourful and unique expression of grievance. And now, over a decade after I first set my eyes on the petitions, my discomfiture is based more on intrigue rather than ignorance. How are Australian citizens, the hundreds of thousands of school children who dodge and weave through Parliament House every year, not to mention all the international tourists visiting the national capital, how are they being asked to remember this critical incident that brought these artefacts the almost 4,500 kilometres from Yirrkala to Canberra? Are the bark petitions illustrative of higher order nation building, as their placement in the Members' Gallery suggests? Are they an icon of disruption? Am I supposed to feel proud, patriotic, standing here looking down at these objects, laid flat behind glass, reflecting back my own white face? Am I supposed to be uncomfortable? How do I read a document whose language, both written and pictorial, is so alien? And how to emotionally locate a memorial when you don't know what you're supposed to be honouring? Finally, what to make of the fact that old-timers and Canberra insiders will tell you that the bark petitions used to be displayed alongside the Australian Constitution and the Commonwealth's copy of the Magna Carta. Was the relocation a downgrading of their significance in the national imaginary, or was it a promotion to sit beside the roll call of Prime Ministers and Governors General? Or is the present position in what Parliament House people call the shed simply a matter of practicality, a bureaucratic decision based on light or space or conservation considerations? Now, existing literature won't provide much guidance on these questions. And for starters, that's because conventional accounts of mining's role in Australia's history represent the exploration, extraction and exploitation of mineral resources as a story of unchecked progress and national wish fulfilment, the sometimes shimmering but ever-solid bedrock of a lucky country. It's a convenient narrative for a settler society. Geoffrey Blaney was right. The rush never did end, and you in Western Australia know that better than anybody. But after the national tragedy of Jukan Gorge in 2020, when caves on the Putu, Kunti, Kurara and Pinikara lands of the Pilbara, containing 46,000 years of human history, were blown up by mining giants Rio Tinto. A PR explosion felt around the world. Surely this narrative has reached its moral, environmental, and political use-by date. I want to know, I set out to find out whether there was another way to tell the historical mining story other than as a nationalist paean clearly at odds with present community standards of corporate accountability. Now, such critical recasting is important, for mining has unequivocally transformed both ecologies and economies in a settler world, as well as determining power dynamics between and within communities. So, in the devastating wake of Yirrkala, it's timely to ask, can the extractive frontier be just as important as the military front and as the military front line in defining the story of our nation? Clearly, I think it can, and I also think it must, if we are come to a more mature, more nuanced, more inclusive, and more environmentally, politically, and socially sustainable understanding of our nation's past, its future, and its present. And that's why I spent the last decade writing Ṉäku Dhäruk, the story of those objects that lie mute under their glass house. I can't give you all the answers to some of those questions that I raised, but I want to use tonight's opportunity to do two things. First, I want to draw out some of the particularly Western Australian connections to this fascinating and little-known aspect of Australian political history. And second, I want to offer some reflections about what happens to history-making and perhaps to the whole process of truth-telling if we begin to join the dots across time, across place, and across race, class, and gender. So the first Western Australian I want to tell you about is Paul Hasluck, whose name I've already just mentioned. Now, the first known geological reconnaissance at Gove, in the Gove Peninsula. Gove was an American airman who came down in the Second World War, and they named the airstrip after him up there, and it's since become known as the Gove Peninsula. Yolngu people call it the Ṉäku region. There are 12 Barparu or clans of the Yolngu people who share that area. Shorthand is Gove. I'm uncomfortable with it. I'll call it Gove Ṉäku. A mission had been established, the Methodist Overseas Mission in 1935, very much with the hospitality and grace of the Yolngu people who welcomed the coming of the missionaries. Hasluck announced a change of policy in 1952, opening up the Northern Territory's Aboriginal reserves to mining, to mineral prospecting. The time had come, he said, to extract the latent mineral wealth of the territory. In 1958, the Commonwealth Aluminium Corporation, or Comalco, which later became Nabalco, was issued Special Mining Lease No. 1 to prospect land on Melville Bay, abutting the Yirrkala mission. According to Hasluck, times had changed since the 1930s, when the system of Aboriginal land reserves had been established, in his words, liberally, but rather carelessly. Now, galvanised by the discovery of that blanket of bauxite that lined the peninsula, Hasluck underscored what he said called the necessity for developing our national resources. Not natural, national. Nothing less than the future of the nation was at stake in this context. Some of you will know that Hasluck was born in Fremantle on April Fool's Day 1905. The son of Salvation Army officers, the bookish Hasluck was a reader in history at the University of Western Australia, before becoming Australia's first permanent representative to the United Nations in 1946 and entering federal parliament in 1949, representing the seat of Curtin, which he won with a resounding 14% swing in a previously safe Labor seat. Hasluck was a small but robust man with a bum chin, a tidy moustache and a flimsy comb-over. His prodigious intellect was his most arresting feature. By 1951, he was appointed the Minister for Territories in the second Menzies government. The job made him responsible for Australia's singular offshore colonial possession, Papua New Guinea, as well as the Northern Territory, now celebrating 40 years as the Commonwealth's unruly adoptee after South Australia let go. Hasluck was a politician, but he was an academic first. He, in his own words, loathed self-importance, self-justification, or self-advancement, disfigured by excuses. He liked order, reason, and methodology. He found none of those things in 1963. This was a year in which the negotiations between the government and the miners were ramping up. By January 1963, it was evident that the proposed new leases of the Gove Bauxite Company would encroach on the 2-mile mission boundary. On the 10th of January, there had been a secret meeting held in Sydney between Hasluck, the chief mining representative of Gove Bauxite, Ben Dickinson, and the head of the Methodist Overseas Mission, the Reverend Cecil Gribble. The superintendent at the mission, the Reverend Edgar Wells, had been told none of this. No one on the ground had. On the 18th of February, Menzies announced the granting of the leases, and on the 9th of April, Hasluck proclaimed the excision of land from the Arnhem Land Reserve to make way for those leases. When Hasluck became Minister for Territories in 1951, he installed a new regime. He instigated the Social Welfare Ordinance, passed in 1952, based on a policy platform of assimilation and administered by a welfare branch. Officially, assimilation had been on the books as federal government policy since 1939, but it hadn't yet been implemented in any bureaucratic way. Wards of the state of the Northern Territory now became wards of the Director of Social Welfare. And Hasluck didn't want an expert in Aboriginal affairs or an egghead in Aboriginal culture, i.e. an anthropologist, to fill this role. He wanted a man of what he called energy, intelligence and enthusiasm, somebody who could oversee the healthy bodies, healthy minds policy. And since 1954, that man was Harry Geezy. In telling his life story, Geezy would describe himself as a confident young man, a fact which few observers would care to dispute. He was tall, lean, long-limbed and athletic, with a square jaw and an easy grin. Geezy was blessed with Hollywood looks and cultivated, quote, a lengthy stride and rapid gait. Now, he too was a Western Australian, born in rural Western Australia in 1913, the eldest of 3 children, of primary school educated parents. He was descended from hardy German stock, 3rd generation Australia, a man comfortable on the land and with its people. His father was killed by a falling tree when young Harry was 14 years old. He later moved to Perth with his mother, and he attended the University of Western Australia, the only university in the British Empire to offer free tertiary education at that stage. There, Geezy enrolled in a Bachelor of Arts, joining fellow 1930 students Dorothy Tangy, Kim Beazley, and Paul Hasluck. I've got some more about him, but I know that Athena's going to start yelling at me. Geezy, like Hasluck, does not come off well in this story. And the person whose words I want to use to describe Geezy is this man. He passed away in March. I've been given permission by his family to use his name, Yirrkala Bark. He was the last surviving signatory of the Bark Petitions, and I interviewed him many times during the 10 years that I spent researching this book in Arnhem Land. Mr. Ṉäku called him Two-Tongue Geezy. He told me a lot of stories about the one time that Geezy came to Yirrkala during this whole year and spent about 5 minutes there, got out of the plane, made a speech on top of an oil drum, got back in the plane and left again. Let's move on to a hero of the story. In 1963, the Labor member for Fremantle was one Kim Edward Beazley. He was 46 years old, born in 1917, the youngest of 7, raised in dockside Fremantle, son of a storeman and packer. Like other poor but bright boys of his generation, he started his working life as a high school teacher, and later he studied politics at the University of Western Australia, as I said, alongside Tangy, Geezy and Hasluck. In 1945, following the death of John Curtin, Beazley was pre-selected for Curtin's seat. His electoral victory made him the youngest member of federal parliament. The student prince, he was called. One to watch, a future Labor leader. He was ambitious, yes, but he was also grounded in Christian faith. Beazley was guided by his upbringing in the Churches of Christ and his commitment to moral rearmament, an international, non-denominational, spiritual movement based on the daily pursuit and practice of purity, unselfishness, honesty, and love. Beazley's self-confessed challenge as a politician was, in his words, how to live out God's will and to turn the searchlight of absolute honesty onto my motives. His opportunity came in 1961 when he was chosen to be one of 3 Labor members of the 7-person Select Committee on the Voting Rights of Aborigines. The committee was asked to report on whether the entitlement to the franchise should be extended to all Aboriginal natives or only Aboriginal natives of particular classes. Beazley travelled 25,000 miles with the committee over a period of 6 months, obtaining evidence from 327 witnesses. The committee travelled all through the Northern Territory, but it didn't stop at any of the Methodist overseas mission stations. In Darwin, Beazley interviewed Harry Geesey, who was against the extension of the franchise on the grounds that it was just buying trouble. Geesey, in his capacity of Director of Welfare, testified that the inability to get a drink probably loomed somewhat larger in their mind than the ability to exercise a vote. Athena's just giving me the wind-up. That's not even possible. Along with Gordon Bryant, the federal member for Wills, Beazley and Bryant worked together in close harmony in 1963 to advance the cause of the Yolngu people, to bring the message that their land was being stolen, that they had not been consulted about it, they had not been compensated for it, and this broke every aspect of Yolngu law. What united Kim Beazley and Gordon Bryant was their common belief that, as Bryant expressed, ordinary people can change the path of politics and government. So I want to tell you about June 1963. This is when Gordon Bryant and Kim Beazley, sent by Stan Davey, the Secretary of the Federal Council for Aboriginal Advancement, went up to Yirrkala to talk to those so-called ordinary people, face to face, the first to go and speak to the Yolngu people, for whom that frontier, that extractive frontier, had come so late. They gave him a letter, and it was a letter that they had drafted and had translated from Yolngu into English, and also written down in Yolngu, because no Yolngu people at this stage were literate in Yolngu Mata. It's a language that had only actually been codified by a Methodist missionary 10 years earlier. I won't read the letter now because of time constraints, but essentially it said this: "We have heard that the government told us nothing of this before it took place. We do not believe that your government would treat white people in this way. We believe our occupancy of this land was lawful, and we believe our age-old occupancy of this land gives us rights which should not be brushed aside." Kim Beazley, that morning, had been taken by Reverend Wells out to the place where the Yolngu people fished. There he'd met Mungaraway, the father of Galarina Pingu, on his home ground. He later met Mawalan and Wanjuk, who also had special claims of Ririchingu landowners, and that day made an impression on them. Later that day, Edgar found Kim Beazley and Gordon Bryant in the church, contemplating the church panels. Now, the church panels are an important part of this story. This is the old church. This is the new church that started to be built by Dungala and Keith Graham in 1963. And Reverend Wells had asked the Yolngu elders to contribute something to this new church. And what they contributed were these church panels, that if you know how they read them, you can actually understand everything there is to know about Yolngu cosmology, politics, land holdings, governance, kinship systems, spirituality, ontology, and existentialism. They are like the Sistine Chapel or the Encyclopedia Britannica, only more so. Kim Beazley stood in front of these panels on that day and he said this: make a bark petition. A petition surrounded with an Aboriginal painting will be irresistible. An illuminated bark painting. Now that would arrest the attention of the media, said Kim Beazley. Beazley was a religious man, but he was also a Democrat. He was deeply committed to the equal rights of Australia's First Peoples. He advised the Yolngu to petition the Parliament because he, quote, took seriously everything that has been said about the citizenship of Australian Aborigines by the department. And so this petition, which then, I can't tell you exactly how I know, well I can, because I'm just going to take another minute, Athena. I was very fortunate to be, Kim's giving me the thumbs up, everyone. I was very fortunate to be able to make contact with Jim Wells, the son of Reverend Edgar and his wife Anne Wells. I did this by a bit of old-fashioned historical foot slogging, which involves a finger and going through the white pages, ringing up every J. Wells, until I finally hit on somebody who answered yes to the question, are you Edgar and Anne Wells' son? Then I asked him whether he had any of their belongings, and he told me he had everything, that he had not thrown anything away, that when his father passed away, he had just closed the door on the most extraordinary archive. We're here in a building full of archives, and there are many historians in the room. They will know what this extraordinary moment felt like, knowing that I was the first person to ever see these documents since Edgar and Anne had written them. Jim himself had never touched them. And these documents, this precious treasure trove, gave answers to questions that have been lingering about the bark petitions that no one's ever known, including how many of them there were and who painted them, when they were sent from Yirrkala to Canberra, and who received them. These are the other two. So the first two I showed you are the ones in Parliament House. One of these ones is in the National Library of Australia, donated by Gordon Bryant's son, who was at my launch there a couple of weeks ago. And the other one, I'm going to tell you about a little story about how I found it. What I also discovered was that Anne Wells was the person who typed them up. She did 12 copies of them, and this was the one that went to Kim Beazley. It's in the Parliament House archives deep down in the basement. Now, each of the characters I've introduced you to has, like Anne Beazley, continue to have a definitive role in the ongoing events of 1963, and I'm not going to give you any spoiler alerts. Some readers have told me that although this is a very fat book, they've read from June to December in one long sitting. Apparently it reads like a whodunit, and it's a page-turner. What I do want to tell you about, I'm going to just quickly show you some of the other characters in this book. If I can go back. Yes, the person standing closest with the spear is a 15-year-old Galarrwuy Napingu. These Yirrkala dancers, schoolboys, danced for the Queen when she visited Darwin in March 1963. It was a big year. Dame Balapu was the person who worked with Anne Wells on writing the petitions. One of the signatories to the petition, Manunu, a group at Larracan is also in there. She was one of the signatories to the petitions. That's Edgar and Anne Wells there sitting together. There's Anne at her typewriter, and that typewriter was also in the possession of Jim Wells, and he's now donated that to the Art Centre in Yirrkala. And that's the very typewriter that she typed up the petitions on. Teacher Beth Graham, with her husband Lee, who built the church. Beth is almost 90. She spoke at my Melbourne book launch last week. She has never stopped advocating for the rights of Yolngu people, but particularly for the importance of bilingual education. Ron Croxford, the principal of the school, who I also interviewed for the project. He passed away 2 years ago, but he was an extraordinary, important informant. And his wife, Marg, who Ron was able to tell me for the first time was the person who did the translations of the petition. These are the Methodist overseas missionaries in Northern Australia at the time. Mungaraway, Birakichi and Ṉäku, 3 peas in a pod, the elders of 3 different tribes who came together across their own various hostilities and clan differences to speak in one voice to the federal parliament. The Marika brothers, Mawalan and Wanjuk and Mataman. Roy Dadanya, often considered to be the father of land rights in Australia. And this is what I want to tell you about now. One of the extraordinary things that happened to me on this research journey was that I was able to locate the missing 4th bark petition. When I told this to Yanamal Munungur, the daughter of Mr. Munungur, the last surviving signatory, she said, Gutara, Gutara is her kinship name for me. Gutara, you have found our lost treasure. It was like my Indiana Jones moment. And here's just a little quick tip for anybody trying to find a missing 90-year-old woman. Try Facebook first. That's how I eventually came across Joan McKee, who was Stan Davies' first wife. He had given her the petition when they had separated, and she still had it on her wall in Derby, Western Australia. So this is my last Western Australian connection that I want to tell you about tonight. When I spoke to her, I asked her, which is a little bit difficult thing to do when you've only known someone for 5 minutes and she's 90, but I sort of said, what are you planning to do with the petition, after you And she said I was planning to hand it down to my daughters, and I said, she said, have you got another idea? And within 24 hours, she had given me the opportunity to help facilitate the petition back to country. And that happened. A contingent of Yolngu, all descendants of the original signatories and artists, came to Derby, and there was a bungal, a ceremony to repatriate that away from Derby. It went to Adelaide to be conserved. Packed in this case, the head conservator at South Australian Museum Art Lab said this is the same kind of case they would use to house a Picasso. This piece of art, this object, was just as important. And then last December, we were able to repatriate the petition to Yirrkala in a very big welcome home ceremony. The word repatriation we tend to consider now is about giving back something that had been stolen. It's very important to recognise that the petition wasn't stolen, it was freely given by the Yolngu. It was a gift. In fact, this is why it's difficult calling it a petition. What I've come to understand since that first time that I stood in front of those petitions, that those days, and asked those questions that I explained to you, is that we call this a petition, but if you understand it from the perspective of Yolngu language, it is not. One day I asked Galarayina Pinga, he's passed away, but his name has also been, I had permission to use it from his family since he passed. I called him Due. He, in kinship terms, is my husband. I was adopted into community by his 4th wife, Valerie Gunnumbar, to whom this book is dedicated. I said to him one day, we were on the way to the funeral of his 2nd wife, and I said, Due, na Yolngu yaku for bark petitions. And he told me. It took him a little while. I was anxious, but then I had to remember that white people like answers to come quickly, and First Nations people often take their time. But that's what listening is about. Truth listening is as important as truth telling. Ṉäku Dhäruk, he told me. Ṉäku is the name of the bark that they were painted on, and Dhäruk means the word or the message. And it comes out of a process of collective decision-making, a process that is intimate to Yolngu parliaments, to Yolngu statesmanship and Yolngu diplomacy. What we're doing here today is having a Dhäruk, and messages will come out of it, words will come out of it. A petition implies a lesser people who are subservient in some way to a greater power to whom they are begging. The parliamentary language which Kim Beazley gave to the Yolngu people to go around that letter he had been given, which he realised should be the basis for the petitions. He gave them the parliamentary language, including the phrase, "Your petitioners do humbly pray." It's not what Yolngu were doing at all. What Yolngu were doing were treating from one sovereign nation to another sovereign nation, from the Yolngu nation to the Commonwealth of Australia. What they saw themselves as doing was engaging in a process of agreement making. They were giving a gift to the nation, a gift of learning and understanding about their country. And if you could read, if the politicians had been able to read the language, not the words, but the language that is painted on the petitions, they would have understood that. Of course they didn't, we're only starting to do that now. The ceremony was extraordinary. There's Jim Wells with the typewriter, and Dungala, bless his heart, managed to hang on long enough to see that petition that he had signed himself return home. And this is from my book launch. All right, I'm going to finish up now, Athena, you'll be pleased to hear. This is the story of our hard-won democracy. It's the story of how democracy as government by the people for the people came to expand its definition of who the people were and are, whose voices would be heard, whose humanity would be counted. My democracy trilogy joins the dots, the flag, the banner and the bark. Workers' rights at Yirrkala, women's rights at Federation, First Nations people's rights in the late 1960s as expressed by the Yolngu people asking for a voice. This is what's in common with all of these items, the material heritage of Australian democracy. They were all people on the ground who didn't have a voice, asking for a voice, asking to be counted, saying that they mattered and that they required that the nation or the colony required their consent. I think what we have to guard against, defend against, is the attempt by malevolent forces and bad actors to narrow the frame of that democratic expansiveness, to slice off democratic values like a thin woman eats cake, one seemingly innocuous, incalculable sliver at a time. A recent review of my book in The Conversation by an historian in his 70s dubbed me as Manning Clark's successor. The reviewer didn't intend that to be a compliment, but I'm taking it for the win, as well as the pull line for my second edition. Manning Clark famously said that there are two types of political leader, the enlarger of life and the punisher and straightener. I think we can broaden this dichotomy to history writing as well as political leadership. There are historical narratives that are generative and those that are at best conservative, at worst corrosive. Those that are maximising, expanding, inclusive, polyvocal, multidimensional, bursting with characters and their mortal and otherworldly dramas, ranging across temporalities, spatialities, languages, philosophies and cosmologies. We love these narratives in our fiction. Think Game of Thrones, Tolkien, Ulysses, the Bible, and anything by Alexis Wright. I want to suggest that the problem with historical narratives that focus on war, that privilege, say, John Curtin's wartime leadership over his anti-conscription activism or his journalism or his industrial affiliation. He did apparently wear his Australian Journalists Association badge throughout his years in Parliament, suggesting a strong pride and identity in non-military sacrifice, solidarity and valour. The problem is that our well-worn nationalist historical narratives tend to emphasise what divides and antagonises us, rather than what has always, if we join those dots, connected us. Social and political division trumps social and political cohesion. I want to end with a speech that Curtin made. It was his election speech in Perth on the 28th of August 1940. Since the outbreak of war, Australians have been asked to join the armed forces and to make heavy sacrifices in many other ways for the preservation of freedom and democracy. The response by the people of Australia has been magnificent, but the words freedom and democracy must be more than a slogan. They must represent real and living things in the lives of ordinary men and women. I'd like to suggest that the real and living things are all around us. I leave you with this image, which is, a year on from the failed referendum on a voice to Parliament, a fitting reminder of the material heritage of Australian democracy, and I hope its future too. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire. Yes, I think generative, a poignant, deaf storyteller. Yeah, we're very fortunate tonight to have had that teaser and that insight into the journey that you've been undertaking over the last 10 years or more. And I think, yeah, it's certainly whet our appetite to learn more and understand more. And I think I was an archivist for a long time in my career, and I think your story around discovering the Wells Archive gave me goosebumps. So yeah, it's such a privilege, and it's such a privilege tonight to hear you. Before we close, I'm going to hand over to the Honourable Kim Beazley AC, who's patron of the John Curtin Prime Ministerial Library, to deliver a vote of thanks. Thanks, Kim.
Can I start by acknowledging the Wadjuk people of the Noongar Nation on whose lands we meet, and pay my respects to their elders. Now, thank Frida for Auntie Frida, your proper title, for a wonderful welcome to country. According to, I think the language of Noongars, I'm a Wadjula, and in this book, my type is called a Balanda. So that's an interesting thing to note here. And Vice-Chancellor, wonderful to see you here. Curtin family, fantastic that you're here. My old colleague, John Cowdell, and ladies and gentlemen. Unfortunately, I failed, and Cowdell likewise with parliamentary experience, we failed to stand and move that the Speaker's time be extended. Because personally, I could have sat and listened to that for at least another hour. And you'd be used to long things, dealing with the Yolngu people or dealing with any Aboriginal people. I remember my father saying to me, as I was contemplating politics, he said, listen, you must go and meet a lot of Aboriginals. And when you meet them, don't speak. Just listen. If they ask you a question, you might speak. Keep it short. And because they've got something to tell you and they take their time telling you, which I thought was extremely good advice because it also conformed with my experience. This book you absolutely must get. You must get it on your shelves as quickly as you can. I thought it was being launched quite recently, but no, it's been out for a while now. So all of you ought to be able to get a copy of it pretty quickly. If you get this book, you will, and I haven't read, and I've read a lot of them, but not all of them, another book that deals with issues that go to the heart of Aboriginal views about relationships to land and country. You don't really, it's very hard to understand it, very hard. But if you read this book, you will. You'll get a thoroughgoing understanding as that concept, or those concepts, are played out against the background of dispossession, of refusal to listen, of tragic outcomes, and even when, in our terms, the Aboriginals get everything right, which is what they did in relation to the petition, we still managed to blow it up. And it is actually, it's a great story, but it's also a tragedy because everything that came out of that parliamentary committee, which was created as a result of the petition, where the recommendations of which we would comprehend completely now, but then they were just dismissed. The mining went ahead with very little consultation with the Aboriginal people in whom the mine was placed, and you've seen the ruination, really, of the region in the photographs that Professor Wright's shown us. So you get that from the book. You'll also get an understanding of where we are at the moment in terms of our ability to relate to the original owners and of this land. You know, always used to say when welcome to country, when I was governor, I was sort of welcomed about 6 times a week. So I'm quite used to welcomes to country. But I always say at the conclusion of it that the Aboriginal community here has one massive advantage over the rest of us. They've been here for 70,000 years. We for a couple of hundred. We are like a second in Aboriginal occupation time. Unbelievably destructive second, more like a political comet hit the land in which they actually find themselves. And that does not reflect well on us. And we still haven't learned to complete the listening process. That reaction to the Uluru statement that we displayed at the referendum was simply appalling. I don't. People are entitled to vote how they wish to vote, but the petitions that we're talking about here, the wonderful folk of the community that have been up before us, they're small, tiny, limited in comparison to the group that put together that statement. That was all the senior elders from all over the country. It was all the people who accept responsibility in the Aboriginal community, and we waved them off. Now, I didn't think we would, but I did, I must say, when it wasn't a bipartisan resolution, I lost hope at that point in time, because they never get through referendums. But the thing that you'd say about the 70,000 years is when they came, well, at least 70,000 years ago, there are, of course, no white people in Australia. What we wouldn't necessarily recognise, there were no white people at all, anywhere. The species Homo sapiens had not yet evolved a white branch. The white branch was evolved 20 to 30,000 years ago. And when we came out of the last great ice age, the most advanced civilisation on Earth, and it has to be said that most of the rest of the species Homo sapiens had been wiped out during the experience of that ice age, the Aboriginals had developed sufficient security in the land. They did not suffer the death levels that the rest of Homo sapiens suffered. So they were the most advanced civilisation on Earth. And they stayed that way because they organised hunter-gathering into a form of pristine capacity that meant they had leisure. And having leisure, they also turned to philosophy. They had time to think. They had time to consider their origins. They had time to consider their science. And the result of that was the creation of a most extraordinary people. But we do need... The other thing about the Uluru Statement, also about this, and it was an issue in this, they don't agree with each other on much at all. They're different nations. We inherited 250 of them, we did for about 100 of them. And they had a nation of nations here when we landed, and that was one of the reasons for their military defeat, though the military stance was substantial, particularly from the northern peoples, like the Yolngu. They were very difficult to get on top of, and that's something that I will make sure the War Memorial makes all of us understand exactly what that means. But because they're entitled to the dignity of resistance. That is a status that is very important when one looks at one's history. Now, you'll see some of the resistance in this. You'll see some of the ways in which they can work quite cleverly with our material to make sure their material gets forward. You'll see some wonderful characters. You'll see some whom I truly despise, but you'll also see some whom my father never despised. My father was a different person. He wasn't me. He was a very erudite and very cautious gentleman. And I didn't know he'd initiated the Bark Petition. And I first found out about it about last Friday. And my wife came across me weeping. I was sitting there and I just wept. And I wondered, why the hell couldn't I be more like my father? And, it's quite something to think about, quite something to contemplate. The Beazley family went down and not up. But Clare has given us gold, absolute gold. And he really helped us to understand who we are and to understand what we need to do. And for that she must be thanked, as she must be thanked for another fabulous John Curtin lecture and Curtin University congratulated for putting it on.
Thank you so much, Kim. That was very heartfelt. And I think it's great that you have a father that you esteem so much. I think that's a blessing in life. And I think you've paid that forward. But that's been a fabulous evening. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And this is the conclusion of our formalities. However, before we step into our light refreshment phase and enjoy some further conversations, I'd just like to ask Claire to come back because we do have a gift for us, a small token. So thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. Lovely to see you here. It's been a great evening and enjoy the refreshments and conversation. All the best.